Until now, we've looked at classical games of chess to illustrate the important opening principles. But it's important to know and to be confident that these principles apply as much in today's games as they did in the early games of modern chess. So now we're going to turn our attention to a couple of games played by Viswanathan Anand with the white pieces. For those of you who are unfamiliar with him, he's the former world champion and longtime Indian #1 and one of the greatest players in the history of the game. So let's take a look at a couple of games of his, and we're going to be focusing on the importance of development, as we've already talked about, but also keeping an eye out on the concept of hindering your opponent's development, right? So not only focusing on bringing out all of your pieces to good squares and as fast as possible, but also realize that your opponent wants to do exactly the same thing. So sometimes it might be worth your while to spend a move just sort of making it a little bit more tricky for your opponent to complete his opening goal. So white opened with the move knight to f3, black played d5, and now white played c4. Very logical, immediately attacking the center and hoping to trade a pawn on the c file for a pawn on the d file, and similar to what we've looked at already, gaining a little bit of control in the center. So black plays c6, dealing with that threat, and now white plays d4. The pawn is undefended, so black grabs the pawn with d takes c4. White is okay with that because after e4, we see white, similar to what we've already looked at, has gained the center. Black plays b5, hanging on to the pawn. White now plays a4, preparing to undermine this structure, right? First with the move a4, and in the future perhaps even with a move like b3. And we notice this bishop here on f1 is putting pressure on b5 and c4 as well. And also it's worth noting that at some point, if white captures a takes b5 and black takes c takes b5, then the development of this rook on a1 will have taken place. And we already saw that in the previous game. It looks as though the rook is just as undeveloped after a takes b5 as it was before a takes b5, but in fact the rook being a long-range piece, it will suddenly be influencing a7 and also a8. And we saw in the previous game how nasty the consequences of that can be. So black has to be careful of one thing, and that is not pushing too many pawns. We saw again in the last game what happened there, and if we step back to the start of this game, we see that in black's first move, he moved a pawn. With his second move, he also moved a pawn. And with his third move, he took a pawn. With his fourth move, he defended that pawn, but that's 4 pawn moves in a row. And so now after the move a4, were he to play another pawn move, he really would be at risk of falling behind. For now, it's okay because white has 3 undeveloped minor pieces and only 1 developed minor piece. But if he were to play, say, a move like h6, and white were to, develop a second piece, then really he could be falling very severely behind in development. So black instead plays the move knight to f6, which is logical, developing, and also pressing that point in the center. White decides to push the pawn on e5, probably because it's quite awkward to defend this pawn in the way that he would like. He'd like to play the move knight to c3, but after b4, he's going to have to move the knight, and then he will lose this central pawn. So instead of this, white pushes to e5, attacking the knight, and the knight goes to d5. White now captures on b5, c takes b5. White is still down a pawn, but now he plays the move b3, and we have to realize that after this exchange on b5, this rook is now active. So in a sense, this exchange here on b5 has actually given white one more developed piece, whereas for black, it has not had that effect. With the move b3, the idea is that now if c takes b3, white will be able to capture here on b5 with check, and then eventually collect this pawn on b3. And at this point, material will be level, but white will have more development and a strong hold on the center. So this is something that black wants to avoid. So black instead played the move queen to c7, defending the pawn on c4 in a different way. But white now plays knight to a3, attacking the b5 pawn and also putting further pressure on the c4 pawn. And now we see once again the nasty effect of the opening of that a file. If black plays the move a6, white will respond with knight takes b5, hitting the queen. And if a takes b5, white captures the rook, and we see once again the effect of that x-ray. So, of course, if black cannot recapture the knight, then after this pawn is taken, he will find himself actually in a very, very bad situation. In fact, he will be the one down a pawn instead of up a pawn. So after knight a3, instead, black played the move queen a5 check. But here, the problem is that black has played first queen to c7 and now queen to a5. So he's moving pieces twice in a row. We saw also in the case of this knight, the knight went to f6 first and then the knight to d5. So if you're moving your pieces twice in a row and your opponent is not doing that, you're going to fall behind in development very quickly. White simply blocked the check, and now we see black's idea. Black's idea was c3, hitting the bishop on d2, and now if the bishop moves, let's say it goes to somewhere like g5, then black will be able to play a move like b4. And now these pawns are no longer on the light squares from which they were being attacked by the knight and by the bishop, and also even by this pawn, but instead they're now on the dark squares, with this one being a protected passed pawn. So this is not something that white wants, because then it will be very difficult for him to recover his material. But the question is what to do. After bishop to d2, c3, you have a piece under attack. But the problem is that what is white to do other than move his bishop? Well, Vishy Anand begins by capturing on b5 with check, right? So he's now recovered his pawn and he's going to deal with this threat afterwards. So black here made a mistake. He played the move knight to d7. And the reason this is a mistake is because we have this developed bishop on b5, and black could have, instead of blocking with the knight, could have blocked with the bishop. And then after, let's say, bishop takes d7, knight takes d7, we have a situation where white's developed bishop was exchanged for black's previously undeveloped bishop on c8. However, after the move knight to d7, we get basically the same position, but with this bishop here on b5 and this bishop on c8 still on the board. And of course, that's going to favor white since his bishop is one more developed piece. And this mistake gives white a chance to uncork a very nice sacrifice of material. Rather than move the bishop, let's say if he moves the bishop to somewhere like g5, where it's not really doing much, after which black could even push this pawn c2 with check and an attack on the queen. And this would actually be very dangerous, because after a move like queen to d2 blocking, then white may be in trouble after c1 queen with check. Now I cannot take the queen because of this pin. And now if I play rook takes queen, well, this rook was defending the knight on a3. So now queen takes a3, and the position is very messy. White may be able to recover the material with a move like bishop to c6, but really this is not a road that white wants to go down unless he has nothing better. So Instead, in this position, Anand played the very nice move, castle. Simply ignoring the attack on the bishop. And Anand, what he is saying with this move is, you can win a piece, but keep in mind that the third point, which we still haven't focused on, king safety, has been addressed by Anand. The center, which was the first point we talked about, is there. And also, after c takes d2, black will be up a piece, but he's had to move another pawn in order to do that, make another pawn move. And if we look at the development, we see that white has this semi-open A file, so his rook is active, his knight is active, his bishop is active, this knight on f3 is active. So that's 4 pieces. Whereas for black, well, his pieces are, this queen is developed but very vulnerable, this knight is developed but undefended, this knight is developed but pinned, right? So he has less pieces and they're all on very dangerous squares. So white plays the move bishop to c6, hitting the rook on a8, and also hitting this knight on d5. And after the move rook to b8, knight to c4. And we see that in fact the sacrifice of the bishop was only temporary, because now that rook on a1 is hitting the queen, and there is no way for the queen to move and still be defending this knight on d5. Notice that the b5 and c5 squares are both being covered by white pieces or pawns. So black played the move queen to d8. Now here white actually just captured the knight on d5 and won shortly after. But I wanted to show one thing, and that is that white had an even stronger move that Anand missed. Instead of bishop takes knight, he could have played the move e6. Now, it seems like a little bit of a mysterious move at first, because after f takes e6, in fact, white has given up a pawn and allowed black to now be defending the knight on d5. But the idea is that after, for example, bishop takes d5 as in the game, black responded with the move e6, and after the bishop moved, black could continue his development. So he could play a move like bishop to e7. Now let's say white captures this pawn on a7, for example, and black could castle. Now the position is horrible for black, right? Because white has more space, more active pieces, great central control, and in fact he's even going to have more material. Especially after, let's say, queen takes d2, we see that actually white has 2 extra pawns, and this pawn on b3 cannot even be captured because of a tactical shot. Bishop takes h7, king takes h7, and queen c2 check, which is a very thematic tactical idea. So the position, don't get me wrong, is really, really bad for black regardless. So Anand's continuation was perfectly fine, but the idea behind the move e6 is very clever, because after f takes e6, we notice that this pawn here, it does protect the knight, but it also blocks the e7 pawn. And it also weakens this diagonal, because the pawn was on f7 on that h5 to e8 diagonal. And now suddenly the black king is exposed. So therefore, what the purpose of this move is to hinder your opponent's development. And this is what I was talking about at the very beginning of the video, that development is 2 things. The first easier concept to master is, how to bring out your pieces in a good way. And then the second, a little bit more advanced topic within development is keep an eye out for how your opponent intends on developing, and make sure that if you get an opportunity to hamper his plans, that you take that opportunity. Let's see how the game might have continued. Rook takes pawn on a7. White is happy to play a piece down, but black now has to try and complete his development, because otherwise white is going to play knight to e5, and then this queen will either go to f3 or to h5 with devastating effect. So black, for example, might play a move like g6, and now white could play knight to g5. Well, what to be done about this pawn. The threat is knight takes e6, and we notice that the queen will be attacked, but the queen has no squares to go to, because all of these squares are being covered by the white pieces. So after knight to g5, black can play maybe the move knight to f4, just to defend the pawn, but now white could simply capture on d2, hitting this knight on f4. And there's no way to defend the knight. I mean, for example, a move like e5 can simply be met by knight takes pawn. And we see that the black knight cannot capture because of this pin. So there is a complete collapse of the black position. If he plays a move like bishop to g7, this knight is falling and it will be game over very soon. And if he moves the knight, well, remember the reason why it got there in the first place was to cover the e6 square. So after knight to e6, we see that position is really horrible for black. Now, the knight previously was covering the b6 square. It went to e5. So now black could play the move queen to b6. But in fact, after rook takes d7, amazingly, look at that beautiful coordination of the white pieces, that effectiveness. Look at where the rook, remember we talked about after a takes b5, the importance of the fact that the rook becomes a semi-open file, and that rook on a1 has a big influence on the game. We said both on a7 and on a8, or if it's a rook on h1, on h7 and h8. And we saw that in the previous game, that rook on h8 found itself in a lot of trouble in some lines. And here on this game, amazingly, the white rook has ended on d7 and will be delivering checkmate, because the threat is simply rook d8 with checkmate and nothing to be done about it. If you play bishop takes rook, then bishop takes bishop is a beautiful checkmating pattern. And if you don't do that, if instead you say sacrifice your queen, hoping that after knight takes queen, bishop takes rook, in fact here in this position white plays rook d8 with checkmate. And it's a mating pattern using the knight in support of the rook and the second knight on e5 covering the escape square. So that would have been an especially beautiful continuation finish to the game. But, you know, even what Vishy Anand did, which was simply to capture the knight on d5 and after e6, bishop e4, I think very shortly after this, black resigned because the position is hopeless. Everything, the piece has been recovered and everything is in white's favor. King safety is in his favor, the third topic which we'll discuss soon. The center is in his favor and piece development is also in his favor. Additional to this, he will end up a pawn or two to the good, so even material will be in his favor. Okay, let's move on to the other Vishy Anand game now, and we will illustrate the same concepts and hopefully gain a stronger hold on these ideas so that we can apply them to our own games. So, I'll see you there.